Oh, we gotta go.
Morning. Can you hear us okay?
Good morning. Yes, I can.
Yep.
All right. Give it a minute or two longer. See if we can get a few more folks to join before we dive in.
How are you doing, Justin?
There we go. Doing well, Marshall. Thanks. How about yourself?
Doing well. Just a heads up, I'm mainly here to see Joe's presentation. There's a chance I may have to switch over to doing it on my phone. I'm waiting for a call to go meet somebody, so I'll try to make the whole meeting, but if I drop out and show back up, don't be alarmed.
No worries. Thanks for letting us know.
Yep.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what. This is kind of an odd meeting. We're in between appointments, given that the commission isn't meeting till mid-December and the appointments generally run through the end of November. And I tried to look up why that was exactly, but that was just the date we gave, I guess. So in any case, we may or may not get quorum here to approve the minutes, so maybe I will drop that down to the bottom of the list, and we can get going with Bryn's presentation since she's here and ready to go, and we can return to the minutes at the end of the meeting if we need to. Before I cut Bryn loose, let's do a real quick round of introductions just to make sure we all know who's online here. So I'm gonna go with online folks first since I'm staring at them, and Marshall, go ahead.
Marshall Gannett, hydrogeologist, formerly with USGS, former GWAC member for a couple terms, and I'm just sitting in today to hear what Joe has to say about the mounding analysis out in the Deschutes. There's a chance I may have some, sit in with the group and kind of brainstorming that issue. Anyway, that's it for me. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. Zach.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Zach Freed. I'm a hydrologist with the Nature Conservancy. I'm also here to hear what Joe has to say, as well as Brian and Tim. So I'm excited about all the agenda items. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity to introduce myself, Justin. I serve on the GWAC. And let's see, maybe we can go over to Robin.
Good morning. Robin Cook, hydrogeologist at GSI Water Solutions in Portland. Listening in before I join if I'm approved.
Right, thanks for being here. How about Eric?
Eric Schneider, Schneider Water. Driller also possibly going to be approved to be on the commission.
So thanks to both of you for being here. I appreciate that. Brent, I'm gonna hold off with you until the end. How about Joe?
Thanks, Justin. Good morning. I'm Joe Kemper, groundwater hydrologist with Oregon Water Resource Department. I'll be speaking later on some work in the Deschutes. The pressure has been put on. Thanks for being here.
All right, and in the room, so Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda Ray, excuse me, and I am the Administrative Specialist for Technical Services Division.
Jake.
I'm Jake Zelenka, and I am the fiscal manager for water resources.
And Richard.
Richard Smith, grouchy old farmer from up in the Portland area. Just an exempt well owner.
And GWAC member. And I'm Justin Iverson. I manage the groundwater section here at WRD. And with that, Bryn, why don't you introduce yourself and you can dive right into the first agenda item here.
Awesome. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me today. My name is Bryn Hudson. I'm the legislative coordinator for the Oregon Water Resources Department. This is Murphy. I promise it is easier to allow him to just be here than it is to try to get him off my desk. But I'm going to be giving the update on the governor's recommended budget for the Water Resources Department. So as many of you may have seen, Governor Kotek released her recommended budget. The GRB is what I will call it moving forward, was developed using agency request budgets, current and projected financial positions of the state, budget policies, current laws, and the governor's priorities. So the GRB essentially serves as the starting point for our negotiations with the legislature and will not be finalized until really until the end of the session in June 2025. So the GRB is the starting point. It is not the final. I'll just note, since I did mention that agency request budgets are kind of the foundation of where the governor goes from her GRB, I wanted to remind folks that when WRD was developing our agency request budget, all enterprise-wide agencies, with a few exceptions, were directed to cap new general fund requests at 1% of the current service level general fund budget because of uncertain budgetary outlooks. For WRD, that came in at just over $1 million in terms of what new general fund appropriations we could ask for. So we were relatively limited in what new appropriations we were going to be able to advocate for within our budget. I don't have any written materials prepared today. We are still working through to summarize the full extent of investments and reductions that impact us. But we are going to be hopefully getting a handout ready to brief our commission on Friday. So once we have that ready, I will be sure to get that to Justin to circulate with you all. But that said, I did want to provide just some high level information on a select number of budget packages that this group may be interested in, and then what legislation has been approved that we will be working on in the legislature during the session. So we have WRD has 4 sponsored bills this session. 2 of them are really for local issues, and then the other 2 are fee bills. So I'll start with the 2 kind of local policy issue bills before I talk about fees. The first bill has to do with temporary transfers and leases in the Klamath Basin. So our authority to approve temporary transfers and leases for determined claims in the Upper Klamath Basin, which for those of you who have been involved in water know that that is undergoing active adjudication and has been for quite a while. That authority sunsets in January of 2026. And if that authority sunsets, we're not going to be able to approve leases or temporary transfers until the adjudication is completed and we can treat those determined claims as water rights under our typical statutes, which ultimately limits the ability for users in that area to actually use and have some flexibility with their water rights. And so typically with sunset bills, we may run a couple bills to essentially extend the sunset date and then repeal it. However, there's a lot of uncertainty around when the adjudication will actually be completed. And so as an efficiency, we are hoping to essentially just have this bill extend the current sunset date and then repeal it once the adjudication is completed. So let it go until we need it, and then once we don't need it, have it repealed. And then everything is groovy in the Klamath in terms of allowing folks to move their water around. The next item is the Harney Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program Other Funds Transfer. This is a technical budget fix bill. So quick overview, the Harney Valley CREP, or the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, is a voluntary program that's operated through the USDA Farm Service Agency in partnership with the state. And the program objectives are really to improve groundwater conditions within the Harney Basin by incentivizing landowners to voluntarily cancel groundwater rights within the GWAC. And so one of the problems here that we're trying to solve is when this program was set up and the initial appropriations were made, it was just general fund, which essentially means if it's a general fund and it doesn't roll over at the end of the biennium, any unspent funds go back, we lose it, we don't get to retain any unspent funds. And so that prevents us from building funding within the program, which ultimately limits how many people can actually be enrolled at a given time, given that payments are typically for non-use for up to 15 years. And so depending on if someone wants a lump sum payment or a contracted out payment, if we can't build that fund up, it really limits the number of participants that we can enroll in this program at a given time. So what this essentially does is it's just a technical fix that allows for those funds to roll over into other funds at the end of the biennium. There's unspent funds, we get to keep it, build the fund, increase our flexibility to allow for more folks to participate in it. The next two bills have to do with fee increases to support several fee programs. I'll start with the big one, which is the water right transaction and dam safety fee bill. This is the bill that comes up every 4 years. And it is a bill that proposes to increase dam safety and water right transaction fees, as those programs are partially supported by fees. We are facing revenue shortfalls to support staff funded by those fees. And those shortfalls are, there's nearly no other way to put it, they're quite large. And so this bill essentially requests to increase the water right transaction fees by 135%. And the dam safety annual fee by 56%. And these increases would maintain existing service levels, which I will not sugarcoat it. These are large fee increases. We are concerned about that. However, the trade-off here is if these fees are not increased, there will need to be a 7 FTE or full-time equivalent reduction in staff supported by the water right transaction fees, which is about half of the staff that are currently supported by those fees. So it is a pretty significant portion of staff. So the next set of fees are well construction program fees, specifically start card fees, and then a suite of well driller and landowner permit fees. And so our well construction program is pretty heavily funded by fees, and we're in a similar situation to water right and dam safety fees where revenues are down. And so this bill proposes to increase the start card fee by 40% and the well driller and licensing landowner permit fees by approximately 10%. WRD is not the only agency enterprise-wide that is struggling with revenue shortfalls. Those of you who have been queued in know inflation is really high right now. We also have services and supplies that are passed on from the Department of Administrative Services that essentially are the cost increases that we have to make up revenue for based on DAS calculations. Those are higher than they have historically been in a very long time. And so you will see some pretty stark fee increases agency-wide. And for WRD specifically, one of the reasons why some of these fee increases are so large is largely a deferred maintenance issue. We have historically not, we being the state of Oregon, has not been increasing things like our water right transaction fees at a rate that actually keeps up with the cost of staff. We have had to administratively manage the budget. We've had to cut positions. Unlike last year where we had a 17% fee increase and we reduced another 6 positions, this 135% increase attempts to maintain current service levels. So we are hoping to not have to reduce positions. That said, I want to note that the department understands the impact that these fees have on fee payers, business owners, and Oregonians. And we do not take asking for these high of fee increases lightly. And so we have been working really since March of the beginning of the year with a suite of fee payers for all of these different fee groups to answer questions, explore other potential opportunities to give a little bit of a release valve on some of these programs to kind of try to offload some of the increases that are needed to support the program. And so we are actively engaging in those conversations and are committed to having those discussions with folks. I'm going to transition to the budget. There is not a whole lot within the GRB that I think this group will be particularly interested in. But I will highlight a few packages. POPs, policy option packages, essentially budget packages, they're new investments. 103 and 102 are essentially companion POPs for our legislative concepts. So they're essentially, they just mirror the LCs for water right transaction and dam safety fee services and the harm correct fund. So I won't go into that too. It's essentially the same explanation as you would get with the LC discussion. And then package 104 is essentially a $22 million POP for our funding programs, specifically feasibility studies, water project grants and loans, and then the well abandonment, repair, and replacement fund. So just a little bit of perspective, 20 million of that is for the water project grants and loans competitive grant program, and then $1 million each respectively for feasibility study grants, and then well abandonment, repair, and replacement funds. All other investments are really directed at filling foundational funding gaps, like scenic waterway revenue gaps with that kind of fill out our work that we do with the Parks and Recreation Department on scenic waterways. And then a few different packages that are really aimed at modernizing our IT and web systems to improve customer service and IT governance. So kind of dealing with some more internal things. And then there is another carryover package, which folks have seen over the last couple iterations of our budget for the American Rescue Plan Act or the ARPA federal dollars to carry over those unspent funds on a suite of different appropriations. And that one's about $3.35 million of the initial 16 million, I think, that we got back in 2021. So we are humming away at spending that money. In terms of reductions, excuse me, in terms of reductions, there, with the exception of the potential 7 FTE reduction package that would kick in if the water rate transaction fees are not increased by 135%. Aside from that 7 FTE, there are no other staffing reductions to our budget. What it is largely is reductions to data collection equipment, maintenance funding, things like that, and specifically, and a few grant programs as well. I will note that one thing that this group probably cares about is reductions to funding for groundwater investigations. So there is about a $800,000 cut to this funding, which leaves us about $500K. And if the legislature chooses to accept this reduction, it would essentially just impact our ability to contract out for groundwater studies. Right now, we are doing about 2 at a time, 2 groundwater studies at a given time. And if this reduction were to be taken, it would reduce our capacity to do essentially just one at a time. So it would cut our capacity in half. Other reductions include reductions to data collection, agromet, stream gauges, as well as some funding for complex issues facilitation funding, which was some permanent funding that we received back in 2023 related to the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation water rights settlement. We received more money than we needed on that. And so it essentially just takes a cut of that general fund appropriation. So that is what I've got prepared. Before I go and open the floor for questions, I will just note that water will remain a large focus for the 2025 legislative session. The co-chairs of the House Agriculture, Land Use, Natural Resources, and Water Committee have released their legislative agenda for a potential water package. That is, we will be going kind of over that at a really high level with our commission on Friday. So if you are interested in that, there's an attachment on the website if you want to kind of review more in depth what that looks like. But essentially, it's a spreadsheet that includes over 35 different items related to water that they are focusing on. Some of it's policy and flexibility, some of it is funding for infrastructure projects or program support. But it's a pretty all-encompassing package. And so we anticipate that we will be busy and water will be of really a big kind of gravitational force within that House Water and Everything Else Committee. And then again, we'll be doing an in-depth overview to our commission on Friday. So if you wanted a little more information than this, feel free to tune in to our commission meeting. And with that, that is all I have prepared for today. So I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Yeah,
Zach,
thanks,
go ahead.
Bryn. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the presentation and the discussion. Can you tell me a little bit more about the groundwater reductions or groundwater investigations reductions? You know, you mentioned that it would basically have the ability for the department and USGS to conduct groundwater basin studies. Specifically, like what's the actual on the ground implications? Which basin or aquifer would not be being studied because of these reductions?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at answering that, and then I'll look to Justin just because this is really reductions to his shop. So my understanding is this is contracting dollars for match with the USGS to pay for them to help us with these. And so my understanding is that right now we are embarking on groundwater studies in the Walla Walla and then 15 Mile Creek. And so what this would do is it would put one of those, I would assume would be 15 Mile Creek because Walla Walla is kind of trucking away. It would put that on hold. It wouldn't say we're not studying it, but it would certainly punt that until Walla Walla is completed, and then we would move on to that one. Justin, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So we will be able to finish out phase one of the Walla Walla study. That's the conceptual model in the publication. Won't be able to start on any numerical modeling in that basin. We'll continue to fund the statewide groundwater recharge study that's ongoing. And we won't have the capacity to start any new large, at least, basin study projects with USGS at this point. Also, we're going to be limited in the amount of dedicated observation wells that we're able to install going forward. So that's the on-ground idea at this point.
Thanks, that's helpful. I don't want to take up all the airwaves, so I'll just see if other folks have questions, especially Richard, I think you're the only other committee member that's actually on the meeting. So other committee members, do you have questions for Bryn?
Go ahead, Zach.
Oh, all right, thanks. Well, I'm also just curious to better understand, especially as the Harney Basin rulemaking veers towards implementing a second SWAMPA, serious water management problem area. That's going to likely require increased measurement and reporting of water use. What are the implications of the reductions to the water measurement cost share fund to implementing and rolling out that SWAMPA?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I won't be able to speak specifically to the SWAMPA, I'm not the policy lead on that. But essentially it is a reduction in the cost share measurement fund, which provides exactly what the title is. It's cost share for water measurement. And so it reduces that funding by, I believe it is $66,000 and it leaves 50K. That is a reoccurring appropriation within our budget. So you'll still get that 50K if that reduction is taken. But it reduces the funding available essentially for that program. I will note that we do have federal ARPA dollars included in the package 106, which is the ARPA pack, like the ARPA carryover package that includes I want to say it's about $800,000 for the water measurement cost share program as well. So reductions to the base budget. However, there is a little bit of silver lining within the ARPA dollars. So I'm not to say that it evens out per se, but there is still some funding. And then depending on when that ARPA, when that SWAMPA is established and when folks are trying to get funding and access funding there, it would just depend on kind of when the federal funds need to be expended and then what the desire is to actually lock into that fund as well.
I guess I just want to add, for the sake of folks that aren't steeped in it, a SWAMPA is a serious water management project area. And essentially that's a designation by rule through which the department can require water use, measurement, and reporting, even of older water rights that didn't have that as conditions of their permits or certificates. And we designated only one of those to date, which was in the Walla Walla Basin. And at the time we had this, well, we still have this fund that's just proposed to be diminished of a cost share fund to help folks purchase meters and have them installed. And as Zach brought up, there are plans for developing this designation in the Hardin Basin, and we'll have less money available to support folks in getting measurement devices installed. So,
yeah, thanks for that clarification. One last budget question. Sorry for grilling you, Bryn. Just really interesting stuff. Good opportunity to talk more about the implications of these reductions. This isn't a reduction, this is an addition, but thinking about the 1 million proposed addition to the well abandonment repair and replacement fund. I remember the original $3 million infusion ran out pretty fast. And I also, don't quote me on this, I probably shouldn't say this out loud because I'm not sure I remember it correctly, but I feel like I remember some statistic about, $1 million corresponds to maybe like 30 potential projects implemented through the well abandonment repair and replacement fund. So all this to kind of set the stage for the question, which is $1 million going to be enough to meet demand in the well abandonment repair and replacement fund? And if not, what would be the number that would meet demand?
Yeah, Zach, that's a great question. And you are correct. Every infusion that we have gotten into the wharf has been applied for and allocated very quickly. The nice part is sometimes projects come in under budget and we get to take some money back and then reinvest that. So that is always a big plus. $1 million is, as we are seeing with folks just snatching up that money, is not enough. It is really hard to get an estimate as to what the number is. So I don't have a good number for you. I think we had initially given some estimates based off of our dry well reporting system, which at the end of the day is it's flawed for a variety of reasons in terms of in terms of the accuracy of that data, and that folks are usually filling that out to get funding, so it's not necessarily a good metric as to how many people actually could take advantage of it. We've given the legislature estimates of between, I think, $5 to $8 million is probably a conservative estimate. That said, the line that we need to toe is whether or not there is a workforce actually able to do the work. So I think that is something the legislature is always considering, balancing a need versus are there even enough drillers to do the work? And does it make sense to put massive amounts of funding into the program? If it's, if folks are going to apply for it and then sit there for, basically an entire budget cycle and then for a driller to get to them. And so that's not to say that there is not a need, but construction work is expensive. And so I think the legislature is always trying to evaluate the biggest bang for the buck. And then the governor's office specifically from this perspective in a kind of a general fund constrained year, giving anything is appreciated over just no investment at all in the wharf. So we know that there is a higher need, but we are really happy to see any money going into that program. And you are correct. It's about 30 to 40, depending on what type of work is being done on a well, is kind of what we think we can get out of $1 million.
Got it. Thank you. That's helpful. And I know it's kind of a moving target with the demand too. And as conditions change, that there may be an increased amount of demand over time, which means that not meeting the demand now, either through the bottleneck of well drillers or through the bottleneck of insufficient funds and wharf, probably puts us behind the mark where we want to be, especially when the goalposts keep on moving. But yeah, thanks. All right, I've got one last question, and then we can open it up maybe to just everybody who has potential questions for Bryn. But the dumbest question of all, but I really just don't know the answer. Bryn, like, what are the betting odds on the Klamath adjudication being completed this decade?
If I knew the answer to that question, I think I would probably not be working for the Water Resources Department. I'd be betting in Vegas. So I can't answer that question. I have no idea. We do know that there is legislative interest, that we have had some preliminary conversations with the co-chairs, so Hellman Owens of that Natural Resources Committee and Representative McIntyre, trying to evaluate opportunities to speed up the adjudication process. However, there are a litany of potential pitfalls that exist with tinkering in the process too much. I don't think I have the time to go into the legal history and all that good stuff and the interaction with the feds, but one of the things that we as a state really need to be careful of is amending the adjudication process too much. And that could potentially kind of circumvent that objective of speeding it up if we mess around, being Oregon, if we mess around with that process too much. And so it seems like there is some policy motivation to do some work there. And really for us at the end of the day, it's also a funding issue of ensuring that we've got the DOJ resources and the resources to pay for Office of Administrative Hearings to actually engage and do that work. So it's a litany of things.
In the absence of tinkering with the adjudication legislatively on the Oregon side, are we talking like 2050 or 2100, or like what's at the rate things have been going? What's your best? I'm not going to ask you for a guess. I know you're already shaking your head, but give me something
we
to latch
are
on to.
moving into a new phase of adjudication, which is exciting. So there is movement. So we're now, I believe, exceptions are being heard by the circuit court. And then a few, the tribal remand is going back to, or has been sent back to the Office of Administrative Hearings. So we are moving forward. I sure hope it doesn't take another 50 years. I believe its 50th birthday is coming up. So, I sure hope it doesn't take until 2100. But again, the court system, there's far too many factors, we tried to get that same answer out of the Office of Administrative Hearings, and they were unwilling to give us a response because they were also concerned about the number of factors that went into kind of giving that kind of estimate that makes it, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk of all the different considerations to to caveat the response. So we are moving into a new phase, so there is progress. But that is to say it's in kind of two separate courts. So it's anyone's guess as to like a decade, 2 decades, hopefully not another 50 years.
Got it. But that means that first temporary transfers and leases bill that you mentioned is really important because it's definitely not going to be fully adjudicated by 2026 when the authority sunsets.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
No further questions.
Well, with that, I think we will move on to our next agenda item. So thank you, Brandon. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. All right. So next on the agenda, we've got Tim Seymour, our Assistant Groundwater Section Manager, providing an update on the Division 512 rulemaking. That's the Harney Basin critical groundwater area designation. To just update the committee on where we're at and where we're headed. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks, Justin. I've got a presentation here. I'll share my screen. So I'm going to run through and sort of give you all a preview of what we're going to be presenting to the commission on Friday morning. There is a time slot held as part of this update to the commission for public comment. So if you all wanted to join and provide comment to the commission specifically about this, you're welcome to do so. And we're also leaving some of that time slot open for members of the RAC or of the public from the Harney Basin to provide comment to the commission. So we've been holding that as a standing agenda item on commission meetings specifically for to give the commission an update, but also to give people the opportunity to comment and speak directly to the commission about issues that have come up as we've been going through this process. So as I go through this, please feel free to jump in, stop me, ask questions, and happy to explain anything I present here. So quick agenda. I'm going to go through a little bit of background to start out with, then a quick summary of the Harney Basin groundwater model, dive into modeling work we did related to defined management scenarios. Then I'm going to talk about how we did some work to optimize management scenarios. And then we'll go through some key takeaways by management element. So those dials, knobs that we can turn in the model and how those impact outcomes. And then I'm going to talk about some next steps. So jumping right in, a little bit of background. The Harney Basin is located in southeastern Oregon. It's a closed basin. Malheur and Harney Lakes lie in the center of it. And really the reason we are focusing policy action here in the Harney Basin is because it's one of the more severe areas of groundwater level decline in the state. And it's been ongoing for some time. So since our last GWAC meeting and last commission meeting, there's been 2 RAC meetings held. And the topics you can see here in this list have included a variety of different things. But much of what I'm going to present today has already been discussed with the RAC. And what I'm presenting here is sort of a summation of those points of what we've talked through with the RAC. Key points with the RAC have been evaluating success, developing management scenarios for testing in the model, and then running through results of those optimization scenarios. And then around the rule framework, we've also been talking about the serious water management problem area, which was brought up earlier, voluntary agreement guidance, and then also looking at fiscal impact. But my presentation here today is really going to focus on those first 4 bullets there around management scenarios and modeling. The department has also been participating in a public engagement strategy that is more robust than most rulemaking processes get. We've added on what are called discussion groups. Those have been hosted by an outside third-party facilitator, Oregon Solutions. And the intent has been to allow the public and the RAC to engage in a forum that isn't a RAC meeting, and to talk through different topics and for, local voices to be heard, and to provide, input into this process. So those topics have also mirrored RAC conversations. And I got to say, the discussion groups were really helpful in development of the first, few predefined management scenarios that we ran. So great opportunity for the public to engage in the process and to provide input. So the goal that the department has stated for this process, for this rulemaking, is that we want to stabilize water levels, and we're doing that in what we're calling a minimum target water level trend of no decline. So rather than defining what reasonably stable means, we're focusing on this target water level trend. So we're not looking at we're not forgoing the amount of magnitude of decline that's occurred, but we're really focusing on stabilizing the current trends and achieving a trend of no decline. And what's that mean? It means that over the long term, water levels are not going to show decline. Our hope is to stabilize those water levels so that they exist within a dynamically stable range. That means in some years, in wet years, we may see water level recovery. In dry years, we may see decline. But over the long term, we're seeing those water levels hold steady at a stable rate. This is going to mean that some wells will show decline, some will be stable, and some will show recovery in any individual year. And then we've also talked about setting some sort of threshold for how any individual well shouldn't exceed a threshold of rate or magnitude of decline. So trying to identify and limit extreme cases and prevent them from occurring. So that's the little bit of the background there. So I'm going to dive into the summary of the Harney Basin groundwater model. So over the past 6 to 8 years, the department has been working with the U.S. Geological Survey, producing different reports. Here we've got 3 different reports that have been released. The first 2 really focus on the groundwater system and the hydrologic budget of the Harney Basin. And then the third one is actually the groundwater model and associated report that was released. And so as we dive into talking about how a groundwater model is built, I want to make it clear that the first 2 reports really informed the third. So when we build a groundwater model, and USGS did the bulk of the work building the model, but used that collaborative work between OWRD and USGS staff as the basis. You start with a hydrostratigraphic framework, which is basically a framework that simplifies the complex geology that exists within a system into a more simple set of units that provide the foundation for how we are going to simulate water movement and interaction within the system. So capturing essentially what are the geologic units, and then what are their characteristics related to groundwater flow and groundwater storage. So we take that hydrostratigraphic framework and then we overlay a uniform grid on it. And when we divide the area into a grid, in the case of the Harney Basin model, each grid cell is 2,000 feet by 2,000 feet length and width. And then there are 10 layers to the model. And so each grid cell, the grid cells vary in depth, but the top 5 layers are 100 feet thick each. And then layers 6 through 10 are varying depths. And there's about 480,000 active cells in the model. So we've taken a very large area and divided it into little blocks in order to try to best simulate the complexity of that hydrostratigraphic framework. So then we assign hydraulic properties to each grid cell. So each grid cell then becomes essentially a single set of hydraulic properties: storage, transmissivity, so permeability, how well water moves through that cell. And then after we've assigned those hydraulic properties, we then go through and represent hydrologic features. So that's going to include things like recharge, rain, snowmelt, stream infiltration, and then we're going to throw on things like discharge areas as well. So streams, springs, we're going to put in wells, and we're going to also simulate natural discharge through, say, like ET. And so then, when we get to the end, we've got this complete model that's going to represent the physics of the hydrologic system. So the intent is that this model is now going to essentially have the physics built, and so we can make changes to how water is being consumed within the model, and we're going to be able to see what happens to underlying groundwater levels within the system. So that's the intent. The other thing we can do with this is create a host of really informative figures and maps. And so this map comes from the start of our simulations. And so it's essentially a visual representation of the current water level trends in the basin. And so in this map, we've got a color gradiated scale that goes from white, which is 0. So this is a water level rate of change map. So 0 means there's no change in water levels from year to year. The darkest of red is -3 feet per year. So water levels are declining at 3 feet per year. And then the darkest of blue is +3 feet per year. So that would be water levels are increasing or recovering by 3 feet per year. And what you can see is that in the vast majority of the basin, we have groundwater level declines occurring. In the upland areas where we have recharge happening, we see water levels that show positive, and that's because water is coming into the system in those places. But where we have pumping impacts across the basin, we have, in some cases, really severe decline, in other cases, moderate decline, and then across much of the basin, we just have broad declines of a little less than a foot per year. And so this is, like I said, a visual representation of the current water level trends in the basin. And so this is really helpful as we try to visualize what's actually going on in the system. And as we've worked with the RAC, we've presented a whole host of figures like this, showing what the water level rates of change do as we make changes within the system. So now let's talk about modeling those defined management scenarios. So to run the model, we have to have a management scenario, and that management scenario needs to define where pumping is going to occur, how much pumping is going to occur, and when that pumping will occur. And so we'll talk through what each management scenario did and how those were defined. But a couple key terms I want to make sure everybody's aware of. Permissible total withdrawal. This is the rule framework definition or term for the amount of water that's allowed to be pumped within a geographic area. So when we set a permissible total withdrawal, we're essentially setting, here's how much water can be extracted in a year. And this is generally an acre foot quantity. And then for all of our scenarios, we're using 2018 pumpage as the baseline from which we're making changes. So 2018 was the last year of water use data that was included in the model. And that is forming the baseline from which we're making changes and evaluating, percentage changes as we talk through these model inputs. So working with the discussion groups and then with the RAC, we defined 5 management scenarios, A through E. And each one had a different objective. The intent was to get a broad range of possible options for management so that we could start to tease out, how did the different dials, if you will, within the model affect outcomes. So you can see A was a department presented or proposed scenario, and it was targeted reductions immediately using 15 subareas. And we'll get more into the details of the inputs. B, C, and D were proposed by the RAC with input from the discussion groups, and they focused on balancing reductions and phasing in over different periods of time. So in the case of B, they phased in over 30 years. In C, they again, phased in over 30 years, but the quantities are different in those two scenarios. And then D was no phase-in period, so immediate implementation of curtailment. But the goal was there, again, balanced reductions, but recovering supply for ecosystems and exempt uses. So a little bit different framing for each one of these scenarios. And then the department proposed scenario E, which was essentially just reducing the basin back to the estimated pumpage from 1990. So to see, 1990 seemed to be the point at which declines really started to accelerate within the basin. And we wanted to go back and see, what does the outcome look like if we reduce back to that quantity of pumpage? So when we talk about model inputs, the first thing is we need to decide where we're going to curtail. So we've got scenario A used a 15 subarea approach, and you can see those broken out here. Scenarios B, C, and D used a 6 subarea approach, and you can see these here overlaying on the 15 subareas, but the 6 are outlined in black here. And in this case, the RAC combined a few subareas together, and then they did ask for one subarea to be split rather than combined. So we split this pink one here, and we did that based on areas of surface water, essentially how far surface water makes it out of the Poison Creek and Rattlesnake Creek areas down into the lowlands here, and we used that as a boundary. And then for scenario E, which is taking the entire basin back to 1990 pumpage levels, we decided to use the exterior boundary of the proposed critical area, which is the Greater Harney Valley groundwater area of concern boundary. And so we used one area for management there in that scenario. So model inputs, the how much and the when. On the right here, we've got a table that shows the scenario and shows the percentage reduction from 2018 pumping levels basin-wide. And you can see that A through E, A was the least amount of reduction at 19%, and E was the most amount of reduction at 59%. And here on the left, we've got a graph that illustrates the amount of pumping implemented in the model so that you can, over time. So we've got the year here, the simulated year, and then we've got the allocated pumpage in acre feet on the left axis. And on the right axis, we have a percent reduction from 2018. So you can see scenarios B and C used a phased reduction approach. And so we linearly phased in curtailment over 30 years from 2030 to 2060, with full curtailment being implemented by 2060. And in the cases of A, D, and E, curtailment was implemented immediately. So pumpage was reduced to the amount or the quantity of the PTW immediately in 2030. We used 2030 as a baseline year so that we could compare all scenarios equally across the board. So that's the how much and the when. So when we talk about measuring success of the management scenarios, we start out with looking at our goal. The goal was the target water level trend of 0 decline. So did we achieve that goal? What we found is that only scenario E, which was an immediate 59% basin-wide curtailment, achieved success in all subareas. That means that all the other scenarios had at least one subarea that did not achieve the goal. A couple of the scenarios came close, but didn't quite make it. So what did we learn? Well, first of all, the proposed PTWs in scenario A through D wasn't enough cut, right? So we were allowing too much pumping to stabilize water levels. And we also learned that proposed PTW in scenario E was too much cut. What we saw there was water levels responded rapidly, and we actually saw water level recovery across the basin, not just stabilization. So if the goal is to achieve a target water level trend of 0 decline and not recovery, then scenario E was too much. And the last thing we learned specifically around PTW was that we need an optimized approach for defining PTW. We had started with some estimated PTWs, what we thought might get us there. And we realized that optimization is going to be necessary to come up with the best possible outcome. So what else did we learn from these defined management scenarios related to management elements or those knobs and dials we can turn in the model? First off, we learned that the timeline to achieve success, so how quickly we achieve success, is directly impacted by the amount of curtailment that's implemented and the timeline for phasing in those reductions. So we had different amounts of curtailment being implemented, and depending on how quickly or how slowly those curtailments were implemented, we saw that timeline to achieve the success shorten or lengthen. We also learned that shorter timelines for phasing in reductions result in higher final water levels. This seems intuitive, but it was great to see it proved out in the model. And our hypotheses confirmed that the faster we implement curtailment, the higher water levels in the basin will be at the end of the model run. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be above the level where they are today. That means that they are simply, they're still going to decline, but they are going to decline less if we have shorter timelines for phasing in reductions. And then the other piece was that shorter timelines for phasing in reductions stabilize natural discharge sooner. So our spring flow, our groundwater dependent ecosystems, our phreatophytes, ET, the faster we implement curtailment, the sooner we stabilize natural discharge and prevent losses to spring flow, stream flow, and our groundwater dependent ecosystems. So that's what the defined management scenarios essentially told us. And so let's dive into now some optimization. So the goal of optimization is to maximize PTW, or the amount of pumping that can occur in the basin, or another way to say that is the amount of beneficial use that can occur in the basin, while requiring stability of water levels. And so to do this, our team did a ton of work, a lot of coding, and basically built a program or a piece of software to be able to iteratively run the model and optimize PTW to a set of parameters. So essentially we give the software a set of parameters, and that can be a timeline for achieving success, the timeline for phasing and reductions, and a success metric. So how do we evaluate success? And then the software iteratively runs the model and chooses new PTW values over and over again until success is achieved in all the subareas. So for our optimization, we used a parameter of the parameters shown here on the screen. The timeline for achieving success was 30 years. So we wanted to have water levels stable in 30 years. We chose a timeline for phasing in reductions of 10 years. So basically we would implement PTW over 10 years. And then a success metric. So the success metric we chose was a median, or a 50th percentile. So essentially we mean that half the wells in a subarea are going to be stable or recovering, and half the wells can be declining still. That's what the median means there. So we then ran the software, and what the software does, and this is a visual representation of what it does. So it essentially, along the bottom of this chart here, we've got the PTW in thousands of acre feet per year. And then along the left axis, or the x-axis, sorry, the y-axis, we've got the rate of water level change at 30 years, and it's the 50th percentile of well cells. So basically the median value, right? And so in the color gradated scale here, we've got the number of iterations. And so what we see is that the software started and it picked a value here on the chart, and it ran the model, and it identified what the water level rate of change was and found that it was positive. And so it ran a second iteration, and it chose a very different value, and it ran a simulation again, and it identified what the water level rate of change was at 30 years. And then here it was negative. And so it ran it again and again and again and again and again. And it finally got to a point where it had achieved stability, and it identified the amount of pumpage within this particular subarea that achieved that goal. And so the fact that all of the iterations land on a basically straight line show us that there is a direct correlation between the amount of pumping and the water level rate of change, and that this is likely to be the best value for PTW that achieves our goal. And so this 35,000 acre feet here in the Crane Buchanan subarea is based on these parameters, the best or the most amount of pumping that can occur and achieve stability. So that's the process it went through. So we then ran optimization for our different parameters across multiple sub-area boundary sets. So we used the 15 sub-areas, we used the 6 sub-areas, and we used the 1 sub-area to try to optimize those different spatial extents to identify the maximum amount of pumpage. And so again, did we achieve our goal? Yep. By definition, optimization achieves the goal. It creates stable water levels at the timeline we set, and it tells us what the amount of PTW needs to be. So what did we learn? First off, that optimization reduces overall curtailment. So we were able to identify the optimum amount of pumping that achieves the goal. We're also going to show here in a minute that depending on the parameters we use, we can achieve the maximum, even more pumping, depending on and achieve our goal, depending on the sub-area boundaries we choose. Another thing we learned is that using a more stringent success metric increases curtailment and results in higher final water levels. So essentially, if we decide to use a more stringent success metric, so rather than using a median, maybe we say that 80% of all wells need to be stable or positive. If we use that more stringent success metric, we see higher final water levels in the basin, but the PTW has to be reduced. So more curtailment has to occur to achieve that. And then the final thing we learned here is that using more subareas can reduce overall curtailment necessary in order to achieve the goal with the same set of parameters. So here's a chart that illustrates that. So along the bottom x-axis here, we've got the number of subareas. We've got 1, which was the GWAC, 6, which was the RAC-defined subareas, and then 15, which was the WRD proposed subareas. And then along the left x-axis or left y-axis here, we've got the PTW in thousands of acre feet per year. And along the right y-axis, we've got the percent reduction from 2018. And then we've got these dashed lines, and these dashed lines represent the different curtailments for the defined management scenarios. So you can see how much curtailment each scenario imposed related to the values on this chart. So defined management scenario A was about 19% or 20%, and E was 59-ish%. And we can see that the different ones bracket these results. So when we ran optimization using the median of well cells being stable, so that means half of the well cells are declining and half of the well cells are stable or increasing, we can see the green triangle is the value. So for the GWAC, the amount of pumping was about 33-ish%. For it's the 6 RAC subareas, it's about 27, 28, 29%. And then for the 15 WRD scenarios, we see that the median comes out to about 27, 28% there, right? So these two values are fairly close. So there's not a lot of difference between the 6 and the 15 subareas when evaluated at the median, but there's just a little bit. When using an 80% of well cells being stable, right? So that means 80% of wells have to be stable or positive, and only 20% can be declining. We see the larger differences between the 80th percentile and the 50th percentile based on the number of subareas. But we also see that more subareas means more pumping can occur while still achieving the goal. And so this is a visual representation essentially comparing how different subarea boundaries and success metrics impact the overall amount of pumping that can occur within a basin or within the basin and still achieve our goal. And remember, our parameters we're going to phase in curtailment over 10 years, and we're going to achieve stability within 30 years. So another point that I brought up is related to the success metric. And so I have said that a more stringent success metric results in higher final water levels or less decline. So here is a map that, similar to one I showed earlier, shows groundwater level differences. So in this case, 0 means that there's no difference between the 50% and 80% stability. Darkest of red would mean there's a 30-foot difference to the negative, and darkest of blue means there's a 30-foot difference to the positive. So if you consider the map, white would mean that 50% and 80% are exactly the same. In this case, blue means that when using an 80% success metric, water levels are higher than when we used a 50% success metric. And you can see where. So after 30 years, we see, a pretty localized area of substantial difference with some broad areas of slight difference. But after 60 years, those areas expand and become darker. And so what we see here is that the absolute water level, when using a more stringent success metric of 80% stability, results in higher final water levels in these portions of the basin. Across much of the basin, it doesn't make as much a difference. But definitely in these areas where we have the most decline, as we saw on that map near the beginning, we're seeing much higher final water levels. And that is, substantial. So then the last thing I'm going to present on related to optimization is how optimization allows us to identify the appropriate amount of curtailment by sub-area, and how it distributes more effectively curtailment across the basin to achieve our goal. So here in this chart, I'm comparing scenario A's curtailment by sub-area with the optimized curtailment by sub-area, and then showing the difference. And as you can see, the department's initial proposal was targeting curtailments in a few sub-areas. So primarily Crane, Dog Mountain, Lawn, North Harney, Rock Creek, and Weaver Springs. And when optimizing, the software distributed those pumpage reductions more equally across sub-areas. There's still a couple of sub-areas, Malheur Lake and Upper Blitzen, that receive no curtailment, but all other sub-areas do receive a curtailment. And in this case, where we had thought we were going to have to curtail the Weaver Springs sub-area by 74%, we're actually able to curtail Weaver Springs by only 35% and still achieve the goal. And that's a 38%, positive change for water users in that sub-area. On the flip side, we had proposed essentially no curtailment in the lower Blitzen or Voltage or in the upper Silver Creek areas. And we're actually seeing that with optimization, we're needing to impose a 31 to 36% cut in those areas, which is a substantial difference. But remember that scenario A didn't achieve the goal and optimization did. And that is the key point here, is that the optimization allows us to distribute pumpage effectively to achieve the goal across the basin. And what we can see is that the total curtailment, remember 20% wasn't enough, we're able to, with 28% curtailment, achieve the goal. So let's dive into some key takeaways really quick. So related to spatial extent, so that, those sub areas, how the basin is divided for management has direct impacts on our ability to target curtailment, the amount of curtailment required to achieve success, spatial variability of water level trends, and potential conflicts with the doctrine of prior appropriation. So when we talk about spatial variability, the more subareas we have, the smaller the well groupings are, the more likely that wells are to track together and show similar water level trends. So there's less variability. Fewer subareas means larger areas, larger groups of wells. There's more likely to be variability in water level trends across those. And when we talk about the potential conflicts with the doctrine of prior appropriation, the more subarea boundaries we draw on a map, the more chances there are for a junior user on one side of a subarea boundary to be allowed to continue pumping, while a more senior water right on the other side of the boundary may be curtailed. And so more subareas leads to more potential conflict, and fewer subareas leads to less potential conflict. So as we talk about more subareas, the other piece of it, the other factor that goes into this is that there's a better ability to target that curtailment at the most severe areas of decline. So as we have smaller subareas, we're able to really address those areas of decline. But as I said, that increases the likelihood of conflicts with prior appropriation. The other piece of it is that more subareas means, as we showed in previous chart there, that less total curtailment is necessary to achieve success under all success metrics. And so if the goal really is to maximize the amount of pumping basin-wide that can occur, then more subareas results in the least amount of curtailment or the most amount of allowed pumping. Now, when we talk about the success metric, we've discussed primarily three options. We've presented a median, which is half the wells show zero decline or a positive trend and half are declining. We've talked about a median plus, which is basically the median, but we're also adding on some sort of individual well threshold. So no well shall exceed a certain amount of decline. And then we've talked about an 80th percentile. So 80% of wells are at zero decline or positive, and 20% are still declining. And what we've seen overall is that a more stringent success metric results in more curtailment being necessary and higher final water levels in the basin. Regardless of the number of subareas we use, a more stringent success metric results in more curtailment and higher final water levels. When we talk about the timeline for achieving success, so how quickly do we stabilize water levels in the basin? A longer timeline for success results in a higher PTW or less curtailment. It also results in lower final water levels in the basin or more decline. And a longer timeline means more reductions in natural discharge, but it also means more opportunity for adaptive management. So the longer you have to achieve your goal, the more opportunity you have to assess how you're doing at achieving that goal and to make changes based on what you've learned so far. When we talk about the timeline for phasing in reductions, a longer timeline for phasing in reductions provides a longer economic adjustment period for those who are being curtailed. It provides more opportunity for adaptive management. Again, the more opportunity you have to evaluate the impacts of changes and adjust those changes, the more adaptive that scenario is. However, a longer timeline for phasing in reductions also means lower final water levels in the basin or more decline. And remember that lower final water levels present risks to wells going dry. And again, that reduction in natural discharge reduces stream flow, spring flow, and also impacts those groundwater dependent ecosystems. And then the last takeaway I've got here is related to adaptive management. So as we're moving forward with the RAC, we're going to be working to define the term of adaptive management and coming to hopefully a shared understanding of what adaptive management means to the department and what adaptive management means as we build out the rules. So Hulling and Borman defined adaptive management as a systematic and iterative approach for improving resource management by emphasizing learning from management outcomes. So what does that mean in real world terms? The goal here is to balance, I guess, certainty with adaptability. And we do that by addressing how often curtailment is modified and adjusting the amount of curtailment based on two potential parameters, right? One would be the amount of curtailment that could be adjusted or the timeline to implementing that curtailment. So when we decide, we evaluate, trends occurring in the basin, we decide we need more curtailment or less curtailment, how much of that, like how big is that value going to be? And then we could also decide to speed up or to slow down curtailment based on where we are in that trend line. So there's more adaptability and less certainty when we modify curtailment more often, and when there's a larger change in the magnitude of curtailment, or when there's a more drastic change in the timeline for full implementation. And on the flip side, there's more certainty and less adaptability if we have less opportunity to modify curtailment, smaller amounts of curtailment that can be modified, and smaller changes in the timeline for implementation of curtailment. And so that's really, as we talk about adaptive management with the RAC, we're going to be emphasizing those points and trying to identify, what is the appropriate balance between certainty and adaptability as we write these rules and come up with a plan for, taking action in the basin. So next steps with the RAC, we've got a list of future topics here. We're going to be talking about, what's a reasonable timeline for achieving the goal. We're going to be talking about, what's a reasonable phase-in period for reductions. Or should we be implementing curtailment immediately? We're going to be talking about the size and number of subareas that should be used to manage the basin. We're going to be talking about the success metric. And then we're going to be talking about those impacts to natural discharge, groundwater storage, domestic wells, and the economy, and how we should be considering those as we're optimizing management scenarios and identifying, the best final, scenario for managing the basin. And then last, for the commission is going to have some future decisions to make. We plan to bring proposed rules to the commission in December of 2025. And we're also going to be bringing guidance for voluntary agreements. And the commission is going to have to decide what proposed rules to adopt and how they balance, those proposed rules with any voluntary agreements that might be presented to them by groundwater users in the basin. And as they're making those decisions, they're going to have to take into consideration PTW and how those voluntary agreements might fit into future management. They're going to need to consider timelines for curtailment and reaching the groundwater level goal. And then they're also going to have to think about those other impacts to domestic wells, spring flow, natural discharge, etc. And we're hopeful that we can continue these conversations and presenting information that helps the commission as they move forward in making those decisions. So that's all I had. Any questions?
Yes, sir. Thanks for the opportunity to ask questions. What percentage of the irrigation wells are metered?
That I do not have an answer for. I do not know.
How can we know what's being pumped if they're not metered?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the department's intent and what we've been discussing with the RAC and are proposing in the rules is to implement a serious water management problem area and essentially require flow meters on all points of appropriation that are actively going to be using water. And so that's how we would track water use by point of appropriation and back to the underlying water right.
Shouldn't that be one of the first steps we take, is to meter all the commercial well use so that we do have an accurate handle on the volume? Otherwise, we're just shooting in the dark. We have no idea how much water those people are pumping.
Yeah, so during a groundwater study, there were a couple of different methods used to estimate water use, and we're fairly confident in those methods. We used OpenET, or I guess it was metric ET at the time, but we used evapotranspiration, like satellite-based evapotranspiration, calibrating that data using eddy covariance stations and flow meter data from actual wells pumping on those fields to identify what the likely amount of or the best estimate of water use is in the basin. And so I think I completely agree with you. Having more data would be better. But with the magnitude and the rate of declines occurring in this basin, I don't think that we can take the time to gather more accurate and comprehensive water use data while those declines are occurring. We need to take action in the basin and increase the amount of information that we have at the same time.
But you're already taking a 30-year timeline to get to zero. So what would be another year of gathering data to be more accurate on where and whom and what area to reduce?
Yeah, so I want to be clear, the optimization parameters that we used in this case are not a decision of the department or the commission related to what we believe an acceptable timeline to achieving this goal is. It was a starting point from which we could evaluate how different actions impact final outcomes. And so that 30-year timeline is not at this point a proposal by the department for what we believe is an acceptable time frame. In future scenarios, we are intending to optimize and understand what the PTW value would be if we used much shorter timelines for achieving success. So potentially as short as 10 years. And as
I come from a critical groundwater area myself. And when it was created, there was no timeline like that. It was almost an immediate reduction across the board for municipalities as well as irrigators. And it solved the problem quickly.
Absolutely. To date, the commission and the department have never proposed a timeline for phasing in reductions. All previous critical groundwater areas that curtailed use did so immediately. And so that is also a potential option there for the commission to consider as we move forward in this process. And we are also testing scenarios where we implement curtailment immediately in full, and then evaluating how long it will take to achieve success if we do that. So,
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Zach, I see your hands up.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Appreciate the presentation. And really want to acknowledge the work that you and your team have put into this. This is setting the bar really high for evidence-based rulemaking. And going from just a year ago or so when we were talking about using whatever the best available data was, but using kind of a hydrograph-based approach to not just using the ModFlow 6 model, but like optimizing it and innovating in that way is a really big step up. So, thanks to you and thanks to your team for really going above and beyond expectations on informing the rulemaking committee and informing the commission in those decisions. One thing I'm curious about that I think you might get questions about with using the optimization tool is the pretty significant change in the optimized PTW for the Weaver Springs subarea in particular, compared to both the prior proposed hydrograph method and the prior kind of model scenarios that the department looked at. I think you'll face some surprise that 38% reductions are enough to achieve median levels of or median wells of no decline or dynamically stable in Weaver Springs. So just in advance, like flagging that is something that you might get questions about. Do you have thoughts on how to respond to those questions?
Yeah, thanks. Zach, that's a great question. So part of the challenge with Weaver Springs is that it is a very, very deep pumping induced cone of depression, and it's a very unique geologic setting in the basin. It's highly transmissive, cinders essentially, surrounded by very low permeability basin fill. And so what we're seeing is that cuts or reductions in pumping within that area result in that cone of depression filling back in fairly immediately and rapidly within the modeling. And what that then does, right, is it changes the trend within wells from negative to positive. And what we've been working on evaluating now is if our optimization is actually achieving, we're calling it durable success. So we might achieve success very quickly because when you take a cone of depression and have it start doing this, filling back in, all those wells in the middle are now positive, and all the wells on the outside are the ones that are going to be continuing to decline. And so you might see a case where water levels stabilize, and wells in the middle go from a positive trend to eventually a negative trend again. And so you don't have success that is durable, right? Beyond the time, that snapshot point in time at which you evaluated it. And so we're working on that at the same time, is to ensure that we're achieving durable success in the Weaver Springs subarea, and not just success at some point in time that then is overwhelmed by pumping impacts. So
That makes sense. Thanks. I'd be curious if, not to ask more of you and your team, but I'd be curious if, that durable success in Weaver Springs is sensitive to or independent from the optimized increases in reductions in Dog Mountain, the adjacent subarea.
yeah, I am interested in that as well. And so we'll see as we crank out the next round of optimizations. We'll be taking a look at how PTW values come out across the different potential subarea boundaries. So
Yeah, cool. One other question in a totally different direction is that, you mentioned the potential for prior appropriations conflicts with more subareas, just increasing the number of subareas. I know that there's some critical groundwater areas now that have different subareas with different PTWs. Has the department seen or experienced any of those prior appropriations conflicts already in other critical groundwater areas? And if so, what were the conclusions? What were the outcomes?
man, that is a question for OWRD Tim from 1990, whoever that was. You're absolutely right. The critical areas in the Umatilla sliced a much smaller area into sub areas, and all of that was worked out in the courts and upheld. So while we are stating that it is likely to cause friction with prior appropriation or more opportunity for conflict, that doesn't necessarily mean we don't believe that we have the authority to do it. So I want to separate those two, and say that it's a consideration that we're taking into account, and we want to make sure everybody's aware of it as we move forward with decision making. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have the authority. We don't think we have the authority, or that we won't prevail if we were to be challenged on that. So.
Got it. Thanks. One last comment, not a question, just acknowledging that OPB article recently came out that was detailing Bill Jager's study. That article seemed to suggest that up to 50% reductions in agricultural production would be needed to stabilize the aquifer across the basin. Just commenting that, I know that the scenarios you are using and testing are different from the scenarios that were taken in that paper. But I strongly suspect that other folks who have read that paper or read that article on OPB might have questions for you about like why are your scenarios, even the one sub area approach, only proposing like 33% reductions or 38% reductions rather than what Bill Jager and others found in that paper and in that OPB article. So just flagging that for, further consideration.
Yeah, appreciate that, Zach. I think I can't really speak to how Bill divided up the pumpage and the curtailments across the basin to achieve you know, stability. I know that they did it on the maximum length of a runtime was 30 years for their modeling scenarios. We're looking out all the way through the end of the scenarios are 2100, so a longer time horizon. But I will say that we are very focused on making sure that we are identifying the maximum beneficial use that can occur in the basin sustainably with stable groundwater levels long term. And so that's what we're focused on, and we're using the tool this groundwater model to do that. And so yeah, well, I don't have much else to say beyond that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it, and for your questions. It's super helpful.
With the presentation and the questions, it is exactly 10:30. We'll move on as per the agenda to Joe and his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Good morning, everyone. Go ahead and queue up the next set of slides here. Is everyone able to see these slides over here? Great. Well, good morning. Like I said earlier, my name is Joe Kemper. I'm a hydrogeologist for Oregon Water Resource Department. I focus on the Deschutes Basin. And I'll be giving a pretty high-level overview of some work that the department is undertaking in the Deschutes Basin. We're just getting started on this now. I'm going to give sort of a problem statement explaining the work that will be undertaken, or why we need to be undertaking this work, and then I'll discuss a little bit about kind of our current plan, how we're going to go through with that work. If at any time folks have any questions, I'll try to stop and ask if there's questions, but if folks have points they want to clarify along the way, feel free. So ultimately, this work is going to be aimed at implementing the new groundwater allocation rules in the Deschutes Basin. So up here, I shared one of the new definitions of reasonably stable groundwater levels, part of the new allocation rules that were adopted recently. I know that there's a lot in these rules, but I'm calling our attention here to sub B that I bolded down there, where it outlines the 25-foot threshold of total decline in an aquifer. And there is a part of this rule that's highlighted here, essentially saying that a reference level for that 25-foot threshold to be measured against may be adjusted if annual high water levels have been measurably increased by human activity. So that is part of our new definition. And I know during the rule adoption or the rulemaking process, there was a few examples of what that type of human activity could be. I think one of the common examples given was the filling of Lake Billy Chinook in Central Oregon, where we saw wells actually rise, more than 50 feet in response to that filling of the water. Aquifer storage and recovery is another possibility. for human activity to influence sort of this application of this rule definition. But the one that we're going to be looking at is historic canal leakage in the Deschutes Basin. So to kind of put a real quick primer for this group, I have two figures borrowed from 2001, Gannett et al. Yes, that's Marshall here. I'm not sure if he's back yet. But I've got two figures from sort of the first groundwater hydrology report that came out of the Deschutes Basin Cooperative Groundwater Study. At left here, there's a hydrograph showing estimated canal diversions from 1900 through about 1996, I believe, 97. And we see several different polygons here showing kind of the major irrigation districts and the estimated rate or volume of water that was diverted for those districts. So each of those is sort of stacking up, showing you the total amount of water that was diverted from the Deschutes River and its tributaries to essentially be distributed around Central Oregon to water crops. And then as part of this basin study, and actually what's been realized for quite some time in Central Oregon, is that these canals were constructed along very permeable, fractured and broken lava flows. And these canals essentially were flowing water straight through these lava flows that leaked quite a bit of water. And there was several attempts to estimate just how much leakage occurred. Essentially what that baked down to is this black line that we see here on our hydrograph. So we're seeing this is an estimate, basically a proportion of this total canal diversion, but what proportion of that was actually leaked into the groundwater system from those diversions. And it's, generally speaking, it's about 40 to 50% of the total water that was diverted actually leaked out of those canals into the groundwater system. So we're talking hundreds of CFS that were actually leaked every year into the aquifers here in Central Oregon. So it's a pretty significant number. And if you think about the, our access down here, it's been happening for a while. So, since about 1905 when that started. So it's a piece that has been, it's a phenomena that's been known and studied. But now we have sort of an example of where we have human activity that has been impacting local groundwater budgets, and that sort of in the new context of these groundwater rules, it is something that likely that we need to kind of investigate more to get at what, if any, changes we would make to applying this definition of reasonably stable. So the next part of the problem here is our groundwater level data. So if we go to the next slide here, I'm showing a hydrograph of 4 observation wells in the Deschutes Basin. Essentially, these are our longest water level records here. Yellow line is a well that's in the Lapine area. This red series is a well that's just in the Sisters area. And then this first green line down here is the longest water level record we have in the center of the Deschutes Basin, really the area between Bend, Redmond, Powell Butte, Klein Buttes. And this is, if you look at the time axis down here, we see that record really only goes back to about 1970. You also note that this is, we've got 50 feet each of these notches is about 50 feet. And we see that there's about 50 feet, 40 to 50 feet of decline in this area. But we also know that there's been significant canal leakage. So, right, that when we think about applying those new rules, We know that there's quite a bit of decline, but also there's been quite a bit of canal leakage that meets that human activity definition. Unfortunately, that water level record only goes back to 1970, and if you recall on that previous slide, canal leakage has been going on since 1905, 1910. And so we don't have an explicit water level record or sets of water level records that would allow us to kind of simply apply those rules. And so this work that I'm introducing today is essentially going to be a department investigation into how we could estimate what water levels were before we began canal leakage in the center of the Deschutes Basin here. So the project goals, like I was saying, we're attempting to estimate how much groundwater levels in the center of the upper Deschutes Basin have risen in response to that historic canal leakage. And again, that will provide the context for applying these new rules, simply put. So at that point, does anyone have any questions before I continue? Good. So getting into methods a bit, again, this is sort of meant to be introducing this work at this point. So the full scope and timeline are still under development. But I do have, I've been thinking about this problem. The department's been considering this for many months now. And so we've sort of been collecting and assembling the likely methods and data sources. I've written kind of the top bullets here for you. Groundwater modeling using the basin scale numerical models that already are available will be a key component. We're going to be looking at as many water level records as we can in terms of long-term hydrographs and groundwater wells, squeezing as much as we can out of the data we do have. There's more short-term observed groundwater response to canal leakage. Those are the two figures also taken from that 2001 Gannon and others report. We see groundwater levels, the dark black lines there, responding to canal leakage or canal flow. Rather, those are those skinnier lines that you see on these hydrographs. So when districts begin putting water in canals, it's certainly been shown that water levels in the deep regional groundwater system do respond sort of on the seasonal basis. So we've also already began updating estimates of canal piping projects. We're just about done already kind of assessing what's been piped thus far. That had not been done for about a decade. So we're just finishing that up now. We're also going to be updating estimates of groundwater pumpage through the present day. And also be taking a look at on-farm loss changes as farm land has been taken out of production as well. So, and finally, there's some stream flow records that we'll be considering to try to get at this ultimate question. Then how we're going to do this. There's sort of been a series of USGS publications that have kind of been a product of the cooperative basin study that really started in the mid-90s in the Deschutes Basin. This is not going to be quite at that scope, but we also the department does not want to do this work in a vacuum. So what the department is sort of assembling a kind of core technical team of folks with who are subject matter experts in groundwater hydrology and specifically the hydrogeology of the upper Deschutes Basin. So we're assembling a few folks that are external to the department, and then a few of us within the department to sort of use this group of folks to guide the scope, look at what we do need to do, refine what work we probably don't have time for, and then kind of periodically check in with those folks as the department steps through this work, have that core team be able to review some work products as well. So that is, so that will be sort of a way to have our work consider the professionals who have also worked in the basin before us to try to kind of take as comprehensive a look at this question as possible. We'll also be updating the public and involving the public over the course of this work. We've already presented sort of this high level to the Upper Deschutes Water Collaborative. We'll be continually updating those in that interest group and others in the basin. Certainly be hoping for feedback from folks in the basin. We'll be periodically updating GWAC here and be able to receive public comment through this venue as well. But ultimately, this will all go. We'll be assembling all this work into an open file report published by OWRD, but also have that opportunity for review by that core technical team. So that's kind of what our plan is right now. I know there's not all that many specifics to deliver at this point, but that's what we have. That's what we're thinking right now, and we're certainly open to input from this committee and anybody else who's interested. So I'll go ahead and open it up for question and comments.
One comment. I know in years past, at least in the alfalfa area east of Bend, there was a considerable amount of flood irrigating done that would possibly affect the groundwater also, as well as the canal loss.
Certainly. And we've gotten similar feedback from irrigation districts wanting us to take into consideration, irrigation practice changes and arable land changes. So we appreciate that feedback, and we're trying to incorporate that as much as we can.
Right.
Zach, what you got?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Appreciate the presentation. Guess two quick things, both quick questions. First off, I know that the core technical work has determined the timeline as part of a deliverable of that core technical team, but I'm just curious, are we talking about 1 year? Are we talking about 10 years? Like what's the level that you're anticipating broadly? Is this a quicker project or a more involved big effort?
I would say, it's difficult to put an exact timeline on it. I think we've talked about, 6 to 12 months is what we're hoping for. If you had to pull an answer out of me right now, it's not, I think that I want to draw the distinction between those, the USGS publications that have come out in the Deschutes, that it's not going to be sort of like a new investigation where we're going out and gathering comprehensive data. We're sort of looking to use existing data sets and tools that we have right now, the resources that were, built and provided in that cooperative groundwater study, try to use those, assemble those, what we have now, and put it into, try to use those to estimate this groundwater elevation question. So less involved than that, but more involved than just us trying to answer something for groundwater reviews. So.
Got it. And just one quick follow-up before I see Marshall's back, so I'll turn it over to past members of the GWAC. But I guess this might be more of a Bryn question. She's no longer here, I think. But thinking back to what we heard earlier about proposed reductions to funding in the governor's recommended budget for groundwater investigations, is this one of the groundwater investigations that may be at risk of being impacted by that proposed reduction?
No, we're doing this with our existing staffing and basically reprioritizing Joe's time and others in order to get this done. So this doesn't depend on that investigations budget.
Cool.
So, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Justin. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Marshall?
Yeah, thanks. That was a good overview, Joe. I think one of the things you didn't mention, maybe everybody knows, is the real confounding element of all this is the fact that, there's a lot of canal piping that's gone on, and as some of the other folks have mentioned, changes in irrigation methods. So it's not, the problem is that groundwater levels have been elevated. It's that they're gonna go down as these conservation measures are implemented. And so that's why we want to understand the magnitude so we not only have to understand the magnitude of the changes that have occurred since, settlement, but also the magnitude of the declines that are going on by these conservation measures. And, Ken and I, as you guys well know, tried to tease that apart in 2013, 2014 or something. And what we kind of found was that it's very spatially variable depending on the proximity of a particular well or group of wells to where piping and lining sorts of activities have gone on. The other thing is that folks have to understand that these are potentially big numbers. There's reason to believe that up around Bend, water levels could have been artificially elevated by, well over 100 feet, maybe close to 200 feet. And there's some kind of temperature data that suggests that may not be uncommon elsewhere. And I'm sure we'll learn more about this here in the coming months. But the one thing my question is that has the department thought about the potential need for some data collection as we move forward? Because I don't think the answer to this problem that you've posed isn't like a number, like, okay, we've got 50 feet to play with here, we've got, it's gonna be teasing out all the different stresses that might be contributing to a decline, should one happen, right? And so, to me, this is something that folks should kind of stick back in their mind, is that as the districts line particular areas of their systems, or large areas, change their irrigation practices, though I think people are generally pretty efficient anymore, at least the big irrigators are. There might be an argument to be made to increase water level monitoring in those specific areas, to sort of look and see if you can kind of tease that stuff out spatially. So people who are really pumping down the groundwater aren't getting a pass because they lined a canal 10 miles away, or conversely, people are being maybe penalized for declines that are caused by something in close proximity. So anyway, that's something to think about, is that I think in really addressing this important provision in the new allocation rules is it's going to probably take continuing effort. And that's a Justin question maybe, but it's just something to think about, that it may be this study that you're working on is maybe the beginning of what is going to have to be a process that's going to be kind of continuous. Just a thought. Anyway, thanks.
No, I appreciate that a lot, Marshall, and I think that I've in internal discussions, and I probably should have said it very explicitly here, that the result will not be a single linear measurement number that could be blanketed across the basin. So I think we're doing a lot of work. I'm trying to line up these data sets of canal piping, projects and pumpage. So we have, really rich spatial data sets of those changes to the water budgets on that local scale. So we can, at least have that information at our fingertips when we're looking at this. I'm trying to, and I know that you even mentioned this about a year ago when you and I chatted, trying to get as many recorder wells in as possible. So, right. So I've gotten a few more. I'm getting some more later this week. But yeah, thinking a lot about how we can get higher resolution water level data going forward for that too.
Well, it'll be a really interesting and useful endeavor, I think.
Mhm.
Should be fun.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts or comments at this point?
All right, well, as Joe mentioned, our plan is to bring updates both to the Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative, group of stakeholders in the basin there, as well as to the Groundwater Advisory Committee as a more statewide venue. Keep folks updated on where we're headed and continue to take input along the way. So look forward to more about this in the future. With that, next item on the agenda is public comment. So want to open up to see if any of our visitors online here have any public comments to make. All right. Well, sounds like folks are good for now. Given that we've only got two official members of GWAC, I'm going to postpone approval of the meeting minutes until March. We'll look forward to having Robin and Eric join us as confirmed members, commission willing, next meeting. So thank you both again for coming in the preview. Appreciate that. And with that, I guess I'll take my prerogative as the convener and close the meeting and wish everybody a good holiday, and we'll reconvene in spring.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep, good seeing
Thank you.
everybody.
All right. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, happy holidays.